Okay, so a little bit different video today. No coding in this one. We've talked about classes in Java. We've talked a little bit about object-oriented programming. But what I haven't talked much about is just the thought process of working your way through at the very beginning of writing code in Java in an object-oriented paradigm. The process of thinking about your classes, thinking about your instance variables, thinking about the hierarchy of who owns what's a subclass of what things belong to what objects, um, because you want to do as much of that thinking up front as you possibly can. We haven't really written any programs that do anything yet. We've been mostly writing programs that are just kind of samples for how the syntax works. But when you're writing more complicated programs that actually do stuff, I think you can see by now that uh, going back and making changes to the class structure in Java once you have one is going to be really, even something as simple as adding an instance variable. You've got to rewrite all your constructors. You know, it's not just as simple as adding a new variable into some Python code. So we want to avoid changing the structure of our classes as much as possible once we've started writing code. Um, I haven't stressed much the past 2 semesters the importance of pseudocode, the importance of kind of sketching out your code before you start. Because again, we haven't really been doing code that really does much of anything. But it is important, especially when we start thinking in terms of objects and classes, to make sure you're clear about what that hierarchy is going to look like before you start coding. So today I just wanted to, on paper, sketch out a class structure and a class hierarchy for a piece of Java code, and then in the next video to actually code that um, those classes, that class structure, subclasses, methods, everything that we need in order to make this happen. So I thought what I might start with is just a simple sort of RPG type combat. I did something similar to this in first semester, where I want to simulate some kind of fight between, say, characters, fantasy characters in some sort of game like a Dungeons and Dragons type game, where you've got fighters who can cast spells, and you've got fighters who can attack with weapons, and maybe wizards who can cast spells. And I want to have them engage in combat. So you can imagine that this is either for like a video game, or maybe I wanted to code in Java a program that a game master, a dungeon master, could use to actually run combat virtually on the side, so they don't have to take care of all the dice rolling and business that goes on in an RPG. So I want my characters that are fighting one another to be objects. I'm going to turn autofocus off for a second because it keeps changing every time I put my hand here. There, that's better. I want the combat to be a class that has two characters that participate in it. So a combat is a class. Your characters will be classes. And the combat will own the two characters that are fighting. Let's make things simple right now. Let's just say it's just 1v1 combat, just one character fighting another character. And then the characters will have various attributes. If we think about your typical role-playing game, and if you've not played, even if you haven't played like a tabletop role-playing game, most people have played some kind of RPG video game where characters have things like hit points, which is how much health you have. Your armor class, which is how hard it is to hit you. If you're wearing armor, you have a higher armor class. Those sorts of things will be instance variables of the character class. Maybe you might have a weapon. Okay, you have a sword or an axe. You might have spells. What roles do those play in the structure of a program? They could just be a string that your character owns. They could be also classes. You can have a class that is a weapon, and the instance variables are the weapon are things like size, damage, range, if it's something like a thrown or shot like a bow. Spells could also have their own instance variables: range, duration, how long they last, and so on. So we could have a class structure where a character owns objects of the class weapon or owns objects of the class spell. Now, we can also imagine that characters who primarily fight with weapons, what in Dungeons and Dragons would be called a fighter class, have different instance variables and abilities than characters who primarily use spells. So we could have subclasses of our character, fighter, we'll call it wizard just for now, that have different instance variables and different abilities that are unique to their subclasses. Okay. And there might be others. There might be priest, bard, barbarian, whatever. Okay. All these characters have different abilities that are unique to them. So we can start thinking about the structure of classes. We can start thinking about the instance variables that are unique to things. And the more I think about this, the more I realize, I might have to have something like, as one of my instance variables for my character, race. Are they dwarf, elf, human, what have you? The more of this thinking we can do up front, the less changes, the fewer changes we'll have to make to this process later. Okay. What about methods? Our character will have methods like attack. Okay. When you attack with your sword, you see if you hit the other person and you do damage to that other character. If you attack with a spell, that might be a completely different method. In other words, these different subclasses might have different attack methods, or I might have a method called cast a spell like a fireball, or a heal spell, which has a different effect depending on the spell. In fact, does cast need to be a method of spell? Now is when we really have to stop and think about structure. Attack is something that the character does. I attack you with my sword, I attack you with a fireball. But the damage of the fireball is something that the fireball does. So I have to think a little bit about this structure. Is cast a method of the character or the spell? Which of those objects owns the idea of casting a spell? My thought is that the character casts the spell, and then the spell has a method called effect, where the spell does whatever it does. It raises your hit points if it's a heal spell. It lowers your opponent's armor class if it's some kind of curse spell. Yeah, I think that's the way I want to do it. So that's just a really quick sketch. Now let's be more precise. Now let's really think about these in terms of structuring our classes. What is our biggest class is combat. Okay. The combat is the process, the interaction between these two characters. So the combat is going to own two characters. Let's just call them player one and player two. Okay, those are instance variables of the combat class. Now, player one is going to be a whole object. Okay, it's not just a number, it's not just a string, it's a whole. Oh, by the way, one of the things that my players should have is a name. Okay, not just a class. By the way, it's I'm going to cause some confusion now because in Dungeons and Dragons, which is the role-playing game I know the most, fighter, wizard, cleric, barbarian are called classes in the game and have been since the 1980s. So I may accidentally say class meaning wizard as opposed to class meaning Java class. So player one and player two are characters. And I apologize for my handwriting here. So there's the variables. What are the methods it's going to have? Maybe I'll use a different color for this. What does the combat class need to do? One needs to have a method called fight. And fight will take as its two parameters, player one and player two. Player one and player two are fighting one another. So the combat class runs a method called fight, and that fight pits player one against player two, and then calls the various methods of player one and player two. Do we need any other variables of our big combat class? I can't think of any right now, so let's keep going. I'm going to have a class called character. Player one and player two are going to be instances of the character class. Character is going to have subclasses that represent the different types of characters you can have. We can have one called fighter and one called wizard. Let's just, for the sake of not boring you with either the details of Dungeons and Dragons or the details of watching me program a whole RPG with 5 different classes, let's just say that those are the two kinds of characters you can be. You can be a fighter character who primarily uses weapons, or a wizard character who primarily uses spells. So there are going to be instance variables of the character class, right? There's going to be hit points, that's going to be an integer. There's going to be AC, armor class, that's going to be an integer. There's going to be race, that's going to be a string. There's going to be a name, that's going to be a string. Okay? There's going to be weapon. That is going to be an object of the class weapon. Well, is everyone allowed to use a weapon? Now I need to make a decision about my class. Let's say that only fighters can use weapons. So not all characters can use weapons, just because I want to make them different. And only wizards can use spells. So these are the instance variables that are shared amongst all the characters. And these are the instance variables that are unique to the subclass. Okay? Maybe you can have multiple weapons and multiple spells. This will be an array list of weapons. And your spell list, your spell book, will be an array list of spells. What are weapons and spells? They're two more classes. There'll be a class called weapon. There'll be a class called spell. Okay. Oh, I've gone off the bottom of my sheet here. Move up a little bit. A weapon will have some instance variables. What are the variables for weapon? Let's keep it simple for right now and just have the weapon be the damage. And for the spell, again, I'm still off the bottom of my sheet here. Let's have one of the instance variables be, let's see. Well, what do spells do? Spells have an effect that can be different depending on what kind of spell it is, right? A fireball causes damage, but a healing spell heals damage. So let's say that a spell doesn't have any instance variables at all. It just has a method called effect. Okay. And the effect method, well, when you call that spell, do whatever that spell does. Increase your hit points if it's a heal spell, take away your opponent's armor class if it's a curse spell, do damage to your opponent if it's a fireball spell. And then you'll have various instances of the spell class, like heal, curse, fireball. Okay. Each of those will be spells with different effects. Does that work? If every spell has a different effect, yeah, the effect method will be different for the different spells. That means that these can't just be instances of the spell. These have to be subclasses of spell so that we can use polymorphism to have their methods all be different. So there might be a generic effect method, but each of these spells, heal, curse, and fireball, will have their own unique effect method. Okay? Weapons don't have that. Weapons, they just hit you and they take away hit points. Being hit by an axe and being hit by a sword are the same. They'll do different amounts of damage. That's a variable. All the different weapons will be instances of the weapon class. For example, sword, axe, dagger. Okay. There'll be instances of the weapon class with a different assigned damage to them. What do characters need to be able to do? They have weapons, they have spells, they need to have a method, which is to use those things. So the methods of your character class could be attack and cast. Okay. The attack method, well, we'll use a weapon. The cast method, you use a spell. And which spell you use or which weapon you use affects which method you call. Do you call the method effect of the heal spell, effect of the curse spell, effect of the fireball spell? Or do you call just the generic effect method? Okay. So how many classes do I have? Combat, character, weapon, and spell. I have 4 kind of master top level classes. The combat class will own 2 characters. The character will own either a weapon or a spell, depending on what kind of character it is. If it's a fighter, it owns a weapon. If it's a wizard, it owns a spell. Weapon doesn't need to have subclasses, at least not in the version I'm programming. I want to make it complex enough to get this idea across, but not so complex that it now takes me 2 hours to program it. We could have 2 subclasses of weapon. For example, we could have a ranged weapon or a melee weapon. Okay? The difference between ranged and melee is a melee weapon is something that I just bonk you with, like a staff or a sword or an axe or a club. A ranged weapon is something that can hit you with when you're way over there, like a bow or a blow dart gun or a throwing star. Let's, to keep our lives simple, recognize that if we were programming a real game, we would probably have to have those be separate from one another, right? Like ranged weapons have ammo. If you have a bow, you need a certain number of arrows. If you have a dart gun, you need a certain number of darts. Melee weapons don't have that. You just hold them in your hand. Ranged weapons have a range. A blow dart will only shoot 20 feet. An arrow will shoot 200 feet. Let's just assume that all of our weapons are just things you whack people with for now. Swords, axes, and daggers. But you can see how you could, if you decided you needed that, make a subclass of weapon. Ranged weapons and melee weapons have different variables. A melee weapon doesn't have a range. A ranged weapon doesn't have, let's back up a little bit. So if you're a fighter, you've got a weapon, you own a weapon, you own a instance of the weapon class. If you are a wizard, you own some spells. And your spells themselves are subclasses of the spell class. So these are subclasses. Okay. This is still pretty chaotic as far as representing this as something I could now sit down and code. Let's see if we can make it a little more orderly. One more step. Okay, let's make this something I can actually code. So at the top level, I'll put there's no rules for how to do this. There's no fixed format for this. Your books and videos you encounter might have suggestions, but you can do this any way you want. These are my classes. My classes are combat, character, weapon, and spell. So I will have to create 4 classes. I'm sorry, that's off the screen again, isn't it? What's behind my head? Character has 2 subclasses, fighter and wizard. Okay. Combat doesn't have any subclasses. Weapon doesn't have any subclasses, although I could create a melee and ranged subclasses, but I won't. Spell will have a bunch of subclasses, depending on the methods that I want to assign to them. Every spell with a different kind of effect will have a different subclass. That's not the only way to do this. Again, I could have different types of spells. I could have attack spells and healing spells. I could have attack spells, defense spells, and healing spells, and then have the individual spells be instances of those subclasses. For now, I'm going to make every spell its own subclass. Let's, again, so I don't have to code a whole player's handbook versus worth of spells, let's make 3 spells. They're going to be heal, curse, and fireball. And they will each have their own effect method that will be slightly different. So that's an example of polymorphism. Each of those subclasses will have its own effect method. Weapon just has one variable, damage. Okay. What other methods do we need? Character needs an attack method, so maybe I should use a different color for. These are my classes, these are my methods. Combat just needs one method, that's fight. The attack method and we'll have to figure out when we implement these whether these have parameter lists or not. But if I want player 1 to attack player 2, if I'm calling player 1's attack method, I just need to tell it who to attack. So we're going to attack the other player. And we can see how if we made this more complicated and there were 5 or 6 characters fighting, I would tell player 1 attack and then tell it in parentheses who to attack. And I also need a cast if you are a wizard. Now, in a real game like this, a wizard can also whack you with his staff. But let's just say, for the sake of simplicity, that only fighters have the attack method and only wizards have the cast method. So if fighters hit you with stuff, wizards cast spells at you. And what you will be casting is the spell. Okay? When I say cast, when I call the cast method, what I will be calling is one of those spells. Cast heal, cast curse, cast fireball. And then in that call, you will execute the effect method of that spell. Okay. What are my instance variables for character? They are hit point, AC, race, name. Okay, those are shared. Fighters will also have weapons, and wizards will have spells. Is that enough for now? I think that's probably enough for now. If you were making a real game and you wanted it to be more complicated than this, you could have an inventory, where in your inventory you also have potions and scrolls and a torch and all the things that you can have in RPG, either tabletop or video game RPG. Okay. Now let's, in a separate video, I won't do it right now, let's sit down and try to code an outline for all of these classes, create constructors for all of these classes and subclasses, and at least a method, a placeholder method that just does something, that just says player 1 attacks or says player 1 casts fireball. And then we can go back and actually make those methods actually make the two players do damage to one another. Okay. We might have to use the random number generator, so we'll make a note up here that we have to call the random class as well. Okay. This process took kind of a long time, and I didn't touch a computer during any of it. It took, I don't know, do I have my timer running somewhere? It took about a half an hour. You should spend, when you're writing real code that does something real, you could spend about a half an hour just sitting and thinking at a chalkboard or at a notebook. What are my classes? What are my instance variables? What are my methods? Everything you do before that will, I promise you, save you time when you actually sit down to code it. As opposed to, if I just started typing this stuff into a window and changed my mind right here about whether weapons were instances of a class or classes on themselves, or whether spells were instances of a class or classes of themselves, I would almost have to delete everything and start over again. Going back and changing something from an instance of a class to its own class would be a huge pain. Okay? So let's leave that there. I will start a new video, and I will actually try to code this kind of complicated mock-up of a simple RPG combat. I'll try to code it with a focus on what is the class structure, who owns what, who owns instances of what, and what are the various data structures we need in order to make this happen.